Hello and welcome to the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society, which is usually known as SANHS. My name's Lizzie Induni and I'm a trustee for SANHS. Today we're going to hear a talk about the timber joints of Dunster by Tony Harding. Tony spent his career as an engineer and project manager in the energy industry. He worked on everything from power networks, IT systems, telecoms, and business improvements. His favourite two projects came towards the end of his career. The first one was in connection with the London 2012 Olympics, where he was involved in testing a fleet of electric cars, which of course he got to drive around and called his big scale electrics. The second involved integrating modern day IT systems into a 12th century former priory. It was this that stimulated his interest in old buildings. He used to think his own house was quite old. It was built in 1861, but now he realises, of course, that this classes as a new build. After finishing full-time employment, he got involved in a number of voluntary projects, one of which was the Early Dunster Project. He's become particularly interested in the various forms of timber joint he comes across while doing surveys within the project. And in tonight's talk, he's going to explore some of those with us. As usual, Tony will take questions at the end of the talk. And as I'm sure you're all very familiar by now, to ask questions, you'll need to activate the chat button at the bottom of the page and type in a question. To find the button, just run the mouse over the bottom of your screen and a series of buttons should pop up. Because we're going to record this lecture tonight, we won't be using names in the question time. It's free to register for the talks, but as always, a donation of £5 towards the ongoing costs of SANHS would be greatly appreciated. The donation button is on the SANHS website donations page. When donating, please label your donation timber. To make things easier, a link to the donations page will also be posted on the chat button at the end of the lecture. So, over to Tony.
Well, thanks, Lizzie, and good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening. As Lizzie said, I'm involved with the Early Dunster Project and have been for about 4 years, I guess. And when I joined the project, one of the main things I did was taking photographs. And I think, as with any branch of photography, any type of photography, if you're going to do it seriously, it helps if you've got a serious interest in your subject. I guess my interest in carpentry goes right back to an O-level in woodwork, which I completed quite scarily 50 years ago this June. Where did that time go? And that's been followed with a series of DIY projects, some more successful than others. And those really are my main credentials for this evening. What I'm finding fascinating about the carpentry I'm photographing and recording in Dunster is not only the superb craftsmanship that goes on there, but also the variety of styles and methods that carpenters seem to have developed over time and down the centuries. And it's some of those variations in styles and methods that we're going to be looking at this evening. So we're going to go on a tour of the roofs of Dunster and look inside with some of this fascinating work and craftsmanship. So if you just bear with me, I'll just start the screen share and we'll get going. Okay, so it should be screen sharing now. So this is my domain. When we go off to do a survey, I usually head straight up into the roof and spend most of the time up there because that's where you're most likely to see features that have remained unchanged since the building was first created. And I would say at the outset, I'm very grateful to the Early Dunster Project and particularly to the people of Dunster for giving me the opportunity and the privilege to spend time in these wonderful places, crawling around amongst this fascinating craftsmanship. So we're going to go on a tour of Dunster roofs and look at some of these features and methods. We'll stop off on the way to reflect on from time to time to reflect on a couple of questions. And the first one is, how can these differences in carpentry methods help us to date the building. And we're very fortunate with Dunster that a number of buildings in Dunster have been quite recently, over about the last 6 years, been tree ring dated. And tree ring dating, very briefly, for anyone who doesn't know, is you take a sample of the timber and look at the relative differences in the widths of annual growth rings, and you compare that with some reference data, and you can arrive at a date that the tree was felled, and from that derive a date that the building was built. You can get quite accurate dates to within sort of 20 or 30 years, a range of 20 or 30 years with that. And as I said, a lot of that was done. It was done by Andy Moyer of Tree Ring Services as part of the time team study that was done on Dunster between, I think, about 2016 and 2018. And it's really good to have those dates because they form a good basis for comparison with other houses, other buildings where we don't have tree ring dates, and we can do this comparison in what they call stylistic dating to give us at least an approximate date. The other question is, can the carpentry methods, this is more of a sort of philosophical question, I guess, can we, by looking at carpentry methods, identify the work of a specific carpenter? And I would love to be able to get to a point where I could say, yeah, there's two houses there and we know they were built around the same time, and you know what, I reckon they were built by the same person. And if we can answer that, the tempting question that flows from that is, who then was that carpenter? And whether we can answer that, I don't know, but let's have a go. So I thought I'd start, just to get us all on the same page, so to speak, with just a quick look at roof construction and the terminology that goes with it. And I think architecture and carpentry, as with any other profession or craft, has its own language, and that language varies from region to region and even from carpenter to carpenter within the same region. Fortunately, there's help at hand. And there's a number of glossaries and booklets that help with this. There's this wonderful little booklet called Recording Timber Frame Buildings. I think it's about £8 or £10, something like that, worth £8 of anybody's money. And it gives examples of just about all the carpentry styles that we're likely to encounter in timber frame buildings, and very usefully it gives names to them, consistent names that we all can use. So we'll be using that as our guide as we go through to terminology. So the basic building block of a timber frame building is a truss. They're sometimes called crux. That's a truss. A crux is a special type of truss. I'm sure some of you will have joined Nat Olcock's superb webinar on crux building back at the end, I think at the end of 2020. And I'm not going to be specific about crux this evening. I'm going to be more general and call them trusses. And basically, to make a timber frame building, you took start with just the anatomy of a truss, if you like. 2 or 3 key features. It's like a big capital A, and at the top there you've got an apex where the two halves of the truss are joined together, and then you've got this sloping portion which sort of defines the pitch of the roof. And that's got a number of names. It can be called a principal rafter, or just a principal, or a blade if it's a crux. I'm just going to, in general, call it principal tonight. You then got the horizontal piece through the middle there. That's called a collar. Sometimes gets called a tie beam, but a tie beam to me is another horizontal member a bit further down, so around the top of the walls. So that collar I'm going to call a collar. And then you've got the post, the vertical bit, post or foot. And we don't always get to see that on our surveys, because that's very often now buried in the walls of the building. So that's the sort of anatomy of a truss. And a timber frame building is based around a series of trusses lined up. It can be anything between 3 and 7 or 8, depending on the size of the building. And then there's a number of other timbers that go around those trusses. And we'll just look at those, not in any necessarily in the order in which the building is constructed, but running through the top, you've got a long timber, and that's either called a ridge purlin or a ridge plate. It's a bit of a semantic difference. If it's set diagonally, like on the left there, it's called a purlin, and if it's set flat, it's called a plate. Not quite sure why it's called a plate. Plate to me says thin and flat, not long and square, but there we are, that's the terminology. Then below the ridge purlin or ridge plate, we've got some side purlins, and there may be 2 or 3 sets of these between the ridge and the top of the walls, depending on, again, on the size of the building. And then we've got what I call the pretty bits, the decorative bits. You've got wind braces, which help to stabilize the building against sort of lengthways distortion, racking as it's called. And you've got arch braces, again, curved members, which help to stabilize the building against side-to-side distortion. You don't always get those. You get those in some buildings, but not in others. On top of all that, you've got some common rafters, which rest between the ridge and rest on the purlins down to the top of the wall. And over that, you've got the roof covering, typically thatch in these early buildings. So you can see, if you just look at this little red rectangle here, you can see how it starts to look like that picture that we started with. So that's a brief look at the sort of anatomy of a roof. So some of these interesting features that these methods that carpenters had, and we're going to look at 3 areas tonight. We're going to look at the apex of the truss, where the principals are joined at the top there, and there's a number of ways of doing that. We're going to look at collar joints, where the collar joins into the principal, and we're going to look at purlin joints, again, where the purlins intersect with the principal rafters. So these are the 3 areas that we're going to be looking at. I thought it'd be useful, first of all, just to pause for thought and think about what makes a successful timber joint. Well, fairly obviously, it needs to do what it says on the tin, join 2 or more pieces of wood together, fairly obvious. But it also needs to withstand all the forces, if you want to use the engineering term, loads, if you like, acting on it. And to enable it to do that, it helps if, when making the joint, we minimize any weakening of the component timbers. And if you think about it, if you're making a joint in some timber, it almost invariably involves cutting wood away, which inevitably weakens the timber to some extent. So we'll be looking at some interesting techniques for minimizing that weakening of the timber. So onto truss apexes then, and I may lapse into calling them apices. The reason for that is some back there in 1972, alongside my O-level in woodwork, I somehow miraculously gained an O-level in Latin. And there's a fragment of the Latin scholar in me that says the plural of apex is apices. Index, indices, apex, apices, but I'll try and call them apexes tonight. So truss apexes, there's been quite a lot studied and written about apexes over the years. If you're just thinking about the forces bearing on the apex joint, and the apex joint has got a bit of an easy life in a way, because in general, the force on it is the weight of the roof, which is tending to push the joint together, hold the joint together. Not always the case, as we'll see. But there's been quite a lot written about apexes and studied down the years. One of the milestone documents was a report published, I think, back in 1981 by the Council for British Archaeology, and it's CBA Research Report number 42, and it brought together all the knowledge specifically about crux, and it brought together all the knowledge of crux at that time, and organized it into some chapters and some categorization. One of the things it looked at was apex types, and it includes this thing which has got this, I think, really nice title of a pedigree of Crook apexes. And I like the term pedigree because it sort of suggests an order of descendancy, an order of development for apexes. And also, I think pedigree, I think, is it's a suitably respectful term for the sort of levels of craftsmanship that we've got going on here. So I like pedigree. There's a lot of we find quite a lot of these apex types in our surveys in Dunster, and some common ones in that sort of red circle there. And there's a table elsewhere in this CBA research report which just breaks out those common forms. So what we're going to do now is take a look at some of those forms and look at some examples of where we found those in our surveys in Dunster. And the first one we'll start with is that they've got letters that they're designated by letters. Don't worry too much about where those letters came from. Just go with the flow that it's called a type B. And type B is a fairly simple apex form. It's got the blades, and I'm going to talk about blades here because all these apex styles relate specifically to crooks. As we'll see in a minute, they have found their way into other types of truss. But we've got the blades meeting vertically, and we've got the ridge purlin just set diagonally at the top there. And here's an example of one of those. You can see the vertical join. Unfortunately, somebody at some stage, probably quite recently, has nailed a horrible piece of softwood there, so we can't quite see what goes on above. But I suspect that is a type B. Very similar to type B is a type M. And it's a little bit more complex, a little bit more sophisticated, that the ridge purlin, instead of sitting on the top there, is actually threaded right through the apex joint. And here's an example of one of those. When I first saw this, I sort of immediately first thought it was a type B, but you can see the purlin is just set down a little bit from the top there. So it's actually one of these type M's just up there. You can see where it doesn't quite sit on the top. So that's type M. We've got a type L1, and that's got a triangular block below the apex with again a diagonal set ridge sitting on there. Here's an example of one of those. It looks a little bit different, that the block doesn't go right to a point, but you can see up here, I think that's the remains of a second peg. These joints are tenoned into there and pegged, and you can see another peg there, so it suggests that this one did actually go up to a triangle there originally. So I'm going to call that a type L1. You can see the dates on that. That's quite early. That's tree ring dated to 1323. That's one that there was a very specific tree ring date for that one. Then we come to type C, and a bit of a difference with this one. There's this saddle that sits above with a square set ridge sitting on the top there, and we've got an example of that. You can see it's seen better days, this one. It's in a bit of a state of disrepair, and I will say at this point, people of Dunster and other dwellers of old houses, you will see some pictures in this evening's presentation that do show things in a bit of a state of disrepair. Don't worry, your roof is not about to collapse. Wherever there's been any deterioration of these trusses, they've invariably been reinforced and either reinforced and repaired, or there's another complete roof over them and they're still in place, but they've been relieved of their load and are now enjoying a well-deserved, well-earned retirement. So don't worry about what you see. But you can see on this one, the right-hand side here is intact, but this left-hand principle has collapsed inwards. There's And if you think about, the load, the main load is the weight of the roof bearing down there, and it's actually snapped this one and it's fallen inwards, and then it's been there's been some masonry put around it in the position that it's in. Up inside there's another truss in this roof, the same style, and that top saddle is completely missing, and you can see it's got this peculiar sort of horn-shaped tenon on the top there that goes up into the saddle on the top, so it's up inside there like that. And I guess it's that's snapped in this case. Now, one of the beauties, I think, of digital photography is we can use it to do a bit of digital carpentry. So what I've done here is done a bit of recomposition. I've taken the right hand side, the good side of the apex, and glued a mirror image of it to the other side, so we can start to see what that apex would have looked like originally. So that's a type C. Another form of type H, and I don't know if it's called a type H because it looks a little bit like a letter H, but it's got again a yoke below the two principals, jointed into the principals, and the ridge sitting squarely in between them. Here's an example of one of those. Again, seen better days, but we can do some digital carpentry, and that's what it would have looked like in its original form. Then we come to type E, and type E is by far the most common type that we find in Dunster. In fact, it's they seem to have been concentrated mainly in the southwest, and it's probably well over half the apex styles that we find are type E. And it's also one that's sort of found its way into other types of truss and into later post-medieval trusses. And some of the apexes there are sort of modelled on this type E. Here's an example of one from fairly early building, again, sort of back end of the 1300s. Here's another one, and it's up inside there where it's joined. It's actually joined with a mortise and tenon joint. So you can see you've got this rectangular tenon on the top of one principal, and that actually locates into a mortise cut on the other side of the principal. So it's a mortise and tenon joint there. Here's one to sort of demonstrate the point. Here's one from, we think, probably as late as the 1700s, but it's still retained this type E format, if you like, using the Kruk technology from medieval times. And then a couple of later forms of apex. There's one where which seems like a fairly obvious one to me. It's where the blades, the principals, cross, and the ridge just sits in the V at the top there. It does actually go back to Kruk days, to medieval times, and it was called a type D back there. But this one is much later. This is in a probably 1800s, maybe even 1900s roof. And then we've got this one. We seen this in 2 or 3 buildings, a later form, and you've got the two principals there, and either side of them nailed, in this case, I think, is a couple of yokes. You've got this sort of sandwich. Not quite sure what happens up in between there, whether it's a vertical join or a diagonal join. I'm going to have to go back and probe around inside one of these, I think, and find out which way it's done there. So you can see we've got quite a number of sort of different styles there that we've recorded in the roofs of Dunster. And I guess I've got a sort of a game of apex bingo going on here. I just need to find a type A there somewhere, and I can complete the top row. So let's have a look at it's interesting to look at those on the chart and look at a bit of timing, because there they are sort of plotted on there with the dates. The dark blocks are ones where we've actually got tree ring dates, so accurate dates for them. The lighter ones are where we've estimated the date from other features in the building. And you can see no sort of particular pattern in that, and I think it would be probably a big assumption to say that if we found another one of the same style, then it comes from that same period. So if we found another type C, would we say, well, we think type Cs are around about 1300? Probably not. What I've superimposed on here, that CBA report number 42, that CRUC document that I referred to, one of the things it did was laid the foundations for a national, what's called a CRUC database, and it's run by the Archaeology Data Service on behalf of the Vernacular Architecture Group, and it's basically a database of all recorded CRUCs in the UK. When I say the UK, effectively it's England and Wales, because that's where we find most of them. So what I've plotted on here is the date ranges of all recorded CRUCs with apex of that type across the UK. You can see most of them prevailed over several centuries there. Perhaps this type M here maybe was of a sort of shorter life, perhaps because it was a more complicated style. You can narrow it down a little bit and just do this, the ones that are recorded in Somerset, and you get a much tighter time scale. But I think it would still probably be a bit bold to say, because we've got some in Somerset that are confined to that time scale, that there aren't necessarily any others outside of that those times, but it's a guide. What I find equally interesting though is rather than look horizontally across this chart, to look vertically down it. And if we look at this couple of decades either side of the year 1300, it looks like in Dunster we had at least 3 different apex styles in play. We've got the type L1, type C, and type H going on there. And the question that prompts me to ask is, what determined the choice of apex style for a given building around that time? And possibly more relevantly, who defined it? Was it the choice of individual carpenters? And we've got these 2 buildings here built a couple of decades either side of 1300, so probably within the career span of a single carpenter. And I'm starting to ask, were they then the work of the same carpenter? Was there more than one carpenter in Dunster around 1300 doing type C apexes? I wonder. And here they are. Here's one that we've already looked at from probably just before 1300, the one that we looked at. And there's another one 10 or 20 years after 1300 that looks quite similar. And again, I've done, it's suffered a bit of deterioration here, so I've done the digital reconstruction bit and put it back together. And yes, they do maybe look sort of similar. An interesting point that comes out of these is just looking at that second one. Can you see some perpendicular lines on the top there? I've highlighted them in red. And those are always a bit of a special find for me because they are the lines that the carpenter would have scribed on there, marking out that joint before they set to work to craft it. And they create a special connection, I think, because you're now not just looking at a joint. I think you're now in the mind of the carpenter that created that joint as he chose that piece of timber and decided where the joint was going to be and set it out. So I think they've got a special sort of presence and connection about them. And we find them quite a lot, but it's always a sort of bit of a thrill when we find those. So that's apexes. So we'll move on now to collar joints. And collar joints are quite a bit simpler in a way. There's really only 2 types that prevail. the job that the collar joint does is, if you think about the truss, the load bearing down on is the weight of the roof, and that's going to try to make the apex, the truss spread, sort of sink and spread, and the feet, the posts to move outwards. Now that's pretty disastrous, really. If you think about the posts in a lot of these buildings were set in cob walls, and if those posts start to move outwards, that's potentially quite catastrophic for the building. So the collar does an important job in binding the truss together there, and you can see a tie beam lower down again. The tie beam does the same thing. So if we look at the collar joint, where the collar joins into the principals, there are two types. Most of the ones we find are a mortise and tenon. So there's a tenon, a peg, if you like, cut on the end of the collar, and that houses into a corresponding mortise cut in the underside of the principal. So you can see the sort of shape of it speculatively there. Here's one where you can see this spreading that I talked about has started to happen, and it's just temptingly revealing the shape of the tenon inside there. Again, people at Dunster, dwellers of old houses, don't worry, this has all been very competently and robustly reinforced. And there's another one where the principle has sort of failed completely, and it's given us a unique glimpse inside of the shape of that tenon. And I love this particular image. I think that's a fantastic bit of craftsmanship for something that's 700 years old. And I never tire of looking at that, and it's sort of unlocked the mystery for me of what happens inside that joint at the end of that collar. So that's mortise and tenon collar joints. The other form we find is a half lap form, where instead of a tenon extending up inside the principal, you've got a sort of dovetail shape, some sort of profiled shape on the end of the collar, and that sits into a housing on the face of the truss, on the face of the principal. And we find these in later houses in Dunster. Most of the ones are sort of 1600s and 1700s. You can see a couple of other examples here. There's all sorts of variations for the exact shape of that end, but the ones we find are all later. But it is known to have been a very early form of joint as well. One of the great recorders, perhaps the greatest recorder of timber buildings, was a man called Cecil Hewitt. He did his work in the sort of mid-60s, up to 1960s, up to 1980. And he recorded hundreds of buildings ranging from Saxon times right through to late 1800s, and identified and documented, and his books contain fabulous diagrams of just about every joint type that you could imagine. And Hewitt recorded these in very early roofs, 1260 and beyond. And also early examples of this have been recorded in Devon, just across the border from Dunster. But it's odd that we've not found any early examples of that in Dunster. We think sort of 1600 and beyond. There's another one there a little bit later. Again, you see it's the same thing, but without that dovetail shape, which sort of helps to prevent spreading. But having said that, this one seems to be staying pretty much intact. And just an interesting little juxtaposition that I only sort of discovered in putting the slides for this evening together. Here's a crux frame, the darker timber in there, from around sort of 1400, and you can see it's needed a bit of reinforcement. And what's happened, and it was quite a common technique to take wood, that's timber that's salvaged from another building that's either derelict or being demolished or whatever, and use it to reinforce trusses in an existing building. And that's what's happened here. And there's this, you see this lighter piece of timber that's put on, effectively, like think of it as a splint that's put on there. And it wasn't until I was putting this together, I noticed that down here on that piece of timber that's been used to reinforce it, you can see the imprint there of one of these half-lap dovetail joints. And there's another one in there. So we've got a truss here with a mortise and tenon collar that's been repaired with timber from a truss that had a half-lapped collar. And what I don't know is whether that timber came from one of these very early half-lapped collar joints or whether it's from one of the later ones. But I just thought it was an interesting little juxtaposition, and you know, don't always believe what you see. So if you look at sort of chronology for collar joints, it's a bit less clear-cut really. Mortise and tenon forms prevailed, the ones that we've actually got tree ring dates for in Dunster, prevailed over a number of centuries there. And we've got some estimated dates that again sort of you know, span a century or so. And then in the half-lapped versions, we've got in dotted here, we've got these early ones that we've not found any of in Dunster. The ones that we're finding there are these later sort of 1600 onwards. So that's collar joints. So come on lastly then to purlin joints. And I think purlins are, to me, they're kind of the unsung heroes in a roof. If you look at there's a nice roof, and you've got the trusses standing there all sort of strong and majestic, and the arch braces and wind braces all curved and decorative, and the old purlins just sort of kind of quietly get on with the job. And it's a pretty tough job they've got to do, because if you think about you know, where they sit, and they've got the common rafters resting on them, and they're bearing the whole weight of the roof. And if you imagine you know, a thick layer of wet thatch, that's quite a weight for them to bear. And you can see here some of the effect that it has on some of them. You can see some of them get quite bowed and bent over time. So it's a tough job being a purlin, really. And equally, it must be a tough job then being a purlin joint. If you think about that purlin joint in terms of forces acting on it, we've got, as I said, the weight of the roof down there trying to sort of shear the joint there. As the purlin bends, we've then got a sort of like a turning, a rotational force on the joint. There's also a tendency as the purlin bends and as the roof sort of bears down on it, there can be a tendency for it to twist as well. And also any shrinking of timber or lengthways movement, longitudinal sort of movement of the trusses is trying to pull the joint apart. So you can see the old purlin joint there is being literally pulled in all directions. And if that joint fails, it's obviously got quite a catastrophic impact on the roof. So not easy being a purlin joint, I would say, compared with an apex joint, which is sort of being pushed together by the load on it. There are a number of types of purlin joint that have been classified you know, over the years as building recording has gone on. There's a couple that we won't mention because we haven't found, they don't occur, or at least I haven't found them to date in Dunster, but there's three types that we do encounter. The first, simplest form perhaps, is what we call a trenched purlin, and very simply the purlin sits in a cutout, a trench on the upper side there of the principal, and it just sits in there. There's another type then, a threaded purlin, where you've actually cut a hole, a mortise, right through the principal, the same size as the purlin, and the purlin is effectively threaded through that mortise, through that hole in the principal. And the third type, tenons, sometimes called butt purlins. I'm going to call them tenons because I think butt is a little bit more specific probably to one particular type. So more generally, we'll call them tenons. So again, we'll look at some examples of each of those in turn. So trench purlin joints. Here's a couple of examples. This one you can see it is actually pulled out. What you can see on the sort of top right there, there's been a new roof, and it's not uncommon for a new roof to be put right over the original one. So that truss is one of these that's now happily retired, but it's given us it's revealed there that trenched purlin joint with and there would have been a peg sort of securing it into the principal there. And here's another example from one of those very early roofs, so just pre-1300. I've got my suspicions about whether this one is actually part of the original carpentry there. I think trench purlins can sometimes be a result of later modification and refurbishment. And if you think about it, if you were replacing a purlin in a roof, this is just practical speculation on my part, but I think you would tend to use a trench purlin, because if it was previously a tenon purlin, we say, which is actually jointed into the principals, then you've got a problem replacing that like for like, because to fit it in there you would need to span the trusses apart. So I think it's more, so some of these trench purlins could be a result of later refurbishment, which is possibly what's happened there. Similarly, if you're replacing a threaded purlin, you've got the challenge of threading a long piece of timber through that roof. So I'm just thinking, beware of trench purlins, that they may not necessarily date from the original. One that I'm a bit more confident is original work is sometimes we get what we call a locking rib in the bottom of the trench. So instead of the trench being cut right out to a flat base, there's this rib left in there, and the purpose of that is to stop the purlin moving lengthways longitudinally relative to the truss. And you can see on the top here there's a hole where a peg has been. So I think the principle with all this stuff was whatever you do, bang in a couple of pegs for good measure as well. So that is and again it's quite common, a trench purlin with a locking rib. Let's go and look at some threaded purlin joints now. And as I said, it's what you do is basically you cut a hole in the principal, the same size as the purlin, and thread the purlin through. Disadvantage of that is you're actually cutting, there's probably a fairly extreme case, but that's quite a hole cut through the truss, through the principal rafter there. So that's going to, thinking about our requirements for a joint, that's probably had a significant weakening effect on the truss. Having said that, that's been there for 600 years and is still going strong, so it's probably proved me wrong. Although they're called threaded purlins, that's a little bit of a sort of misnomer in a way, because sometimes the purlins are actually joined within that mortise, and they're usually joined with some sort of splayed join. Ignore this bit of timber up here, that's new, but you can see the splayed end of the purlin in there. And there's another example, and you can see the sort of start of the splay there, and the length of purlin coming in from the other side would have been splayed in the other direction, and the two would fit together. So lastly, we'll look at some tenon purlin joints. Here's probably the most basic form. Again, this is from a sort of second half of the 1400s, and you can see there, and it overcomes the problem of cutting a great big hole through the principal, but you overcome that by forming the end of the purlin into a tenon, which then fits into a smaller mortise in the principal. You can see it there. I've outlined the shape of that tenon. So if you imagine a section through that joint, you've got the purlin there with that tenon extending into the principal rafter. The disadvantage for that, you've overcome the problem of cutting a great big hole in the principal, but you've compromised the purlin somewhat, because if you think about that shear force bearing down on it, you started off with a purlin that thick, and effectively you've reduced it down to something like a third of its size, and therefore a third of its strength. So there's a couple of ways that carpenters had of getting over that, and here's one, and this has got quite an interesting story to this joint. This one's tree ring dated to somewhere between 1439 and 1471. And you can see what we've got there is this bevel on the upper shoulder of the mortise there that I've highlighted in red there. So what you've quite cleverly done is just made a sort of small triangular cut, if you like, in the principal there. So you've not weakened the principal a great deal, but in so doing, you've allowed much more of the purlin to extend into the principal. So now you've got, most of the purlin actually bearing the load. Now this one's got a bit of a story to it, because this same joint, this is in the roof of the priory, the later section of the priory at Dunster. And Cecil Hewitt, that recorder of buildings that I mentioned, recorded one of these in the roof of King's College Chapel at Cambridge. And he's given it a name. He's called it a tenon with diminished haunch. And Hewitt found this joint in King's College Chapel at Cambridge, and he attributed it to a master carpenter called Richard Russell, and he thinks it was put there in somewhere between 1510 and 1512. There's a bit more clarity on that. There's some very good information on the King's College website, and their version says that although it was built by Russell, it was actually part of a design done by his predecessor, Martin Prentice, somewhere between 1476 and 1485. So I guess Russell would have, he may well have at some point had the rather poetic job title of Prentice's Apprentice. So although it was Russell that put the joint in, it was Prentice's design. And it says down here at the bottom, Prentice's design is said to contain the earliest examples of tenons with diminished haunches. Well, actually not, because here's one in Dunster that's at least 5 years earlier than Prentice's believed design for that joint. So the question that poses then is, was Martin Prentice, the carpenter, involved some way with the priory at Dunster? And if he wasn't, then was the carpenter that did do the priory at Dunster the same person that told Martin Prentice about this joint? So interesting bit of history to that one. It could be a bit of a first for Dunster there. Later example, you've got a similar thing happening here, except that triangular cut into the mortise is below the tenon rather than above it. But it's had the same effect. It's actually brought much more of the purlin into play there, and therefore much better equipped to withstand the weight of the load, the weight of the roof bearing down on it. So you can see that's just that little triangular cut there. Some later ones, there was a version where the tenon extended right through. The purlins at this stage were staggered, so offset from each other on each side, and a peg driven through. And it's rather like if you can picture those sort of farmhouse style tables with the lower rail running through them and a peg banged through where it extends out the other side of the leg, it's a little bit like that. And then lastly, this one confounds me completely. From one side, you've got a bit of tenon sticking out at the top, and from the other side there on the right, you've got a bit of tenon sticking out on the bottom. And I've puzzled and puzzled over this one, and I can only think that inside there's something like this. And I guess using the terminology, you'd probably call it something like a part staggered threaded purling with bridled scarf joint. And what confounds me is why on earth you would do something so complex there in that joint. It must have been a carpenter with a real enthusiasm, a real verve for his work, I think. So purling joints, what can we tell about chronology? Well, tenon purlins look to have occurred, and these are actually from tree ring dated examples, and they prevailed over several centuries there. Trench purlins, we think later, but say with that note of caution that some of those may have been a facet of later refurbishment. And again, from what we've seen at the moment, threaded ones seem to be sort of 1450 onwards through to sort of 1600. So if we put that all together, what I'm sort of thinking is, there's some uncertainty with this sort of stylistic dating, looking at a particular feature, but I'm just wondering if we looked at the combination of features, and we've only looked at 3, there are others that we could look at, whether those in particular combinations sort of help to point us towards a particular date for that building. And I'm drawn again to these 2 buildings, these 2 roofs that were built sort of decade or so either side of 1300. And if you look at it on that basis, they've both got the same type of apex, type C. They've both got tenon collars, nothing unremarkable about that because most of the collars we find there are tenon. And they've both got a similar form of tenon purlin. So it really does start to reinforce that question with me of, and there they are. You can see the 2 trusses in question. And it makes me ask that question, was that then the work of the same carpenter? And I'm wanting to think so, really. And if it was, the question that leads from that is, who was that carpenter? And if I ever find that out, then I promise to do another webinar on it. So with that, I'll hand back to Lizzie, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tony. It's been really good. It's quite nice for me because I always find timber framing quite difficult, really, and it's lovely to have it all spelled out so carefully and so clearly, and all the names given to the right things. So yeah, well done. Thank you. That was great. Yeah, well, hopefully we'll have a few questions. We've got lots of people watching tonight, so please, if you've got some questions, and I'm sure there will be because everybody loves a bit of timber framing, don't forget to put your questions onto the chat button, and then I can read them out to Tony. Well, I've got a few because I was quite interested in the difference, really. It always amazes me that you can draw these beautiful drawings of timber framing with all the joints so beautifully drawn in, but actually when you go into a roof, it doesn't look like that at all. It's actually quite dirty and there's a lot of dust, and I seem to recall seeing you with your boiler suit on, all primed up to climb into the roof, and it's quite hard to work out what on earth's going on up there.
Yeah, one of the things I've realised just recently is one of the things we need to get on the project is a vacuum cleaner, a hoover, a little handheld hoover, because you say that they are full of dust, and it gets into the joints. You've really got to clear away the dust before you can see what's going on. The other thing I do, one of the little tools I've fashioned is a steel tape measure, one of those flexible steel tape measures, and I've taken the hook off the end, so you can sort of use it as a probe, as a sort of feeler gauge, and poke it into joints, and find out where the shoulders and stops and things are inside. But as I said, with that complex example, even having done that, I still haven't really worked out exactly what's going on inside there. Particularly with Purlin joints, they're usually sort of fairly tight still, and it's difficult to get in there. What I have resorted to, and I'm going to have to do it with that one, is actually make one, I think, to see what's going on, to work out what's going on in there.
What, making timber frame joints?
No, just make that joint. No, on a smaller scale. But it's the only way I can sort of visualize what's going on in there, really.
Yeah, they make good teaching material as well. Yeah. And always interesting too that you can name bits of timber framing in one bit of the country, and then you go to like Scotland and they call them different things.
Yeah.
The naming of the parts is quite complicated.
Yeah,
and different.
The Crook knowledge is really centered on England and Wales, and I think there were less common, but there were Crook buildings. Certainly I've seen ruins in Scotland that have got timber members in the wall. I suspect in Scotland they had a completely different set of terminology.
They do.
Probably both formal and informal. So yeah.
You go there and you think, wonder what they're talking about. Well, we've got some questions coming in,
okay,
which is great. Somebody would like to know what sort of varieties of timber are being used.
Okay, virtually all of the roofs in Dunster that we've seen so far are oak, and oak was the timber of choice there. I know elm was popular. I think in South Somerset there's quite a lot of elm, but we've not seen it in Dunster. But I think oak and elm were really the main sort of sources. Interesting in Scotland, we talked about Scotland, and there are some later. They were still using crooks, I think, quite late, and making them from pine. And we only tend to see softwoods in much later stuff, really.
Oh, it's interesting. So when it comes to doing a dendrodate, do you have to have a specific sort of wood, or can you use any wood for
I think they do it in oak and elm, and I think some of these in Scotland actually it said that they dendrodated them in pine, but I'm not too familiar with that. No. Certainly what would be, I think, good in Dunster, some of these later forms where we think from other sort of features in the building they're later, but it would be good to get some of those dendrodated and confirm that some of those later joint forms that we found are actually later. And I would love to date that, although it's not of any great significance, love to date that piece of wood that's used to splint that other truss and see whether it's one of these very early ones or a late one.
Yeah. Oh, questions coming in thick and fast. Excellent. Have any of these joints migrated into metal framework? Would you know about that?
Oh, goodness. I don't know. I suppose, structurally, they in metal frames, you do see, triangular bits bolted on at the top and things like that. And I know on that project that you talked about at the beginning in the 12th century priory, there was a lot of reinforcement done there, and I had to pretend for a long time that I knew what the term meant, but they talked about flitch plates, which is I did pluck up the courage to ask one day, and apparently it's a sort of sandwich. You've got the wood, and then you've got a piece of metal either side, and it's stronger than either the wood or the metal. But no, I guess
it's a different technology, really, isn't it?
But I think in some of these steel buildings you see going up, there's they're not I guess the equivalent of a mortise and tenon, but some of these plates and joining pieces that go on maybe do sort of have some roots back in early carpentry.
Yeah, I imagine so. That's the way things usually progress,
Mm,
isn't it? You start off with
yeah,
one technology and slither it into
yeah,
another
yeah,
before realizing, in fact, you can actually use a completely different
yeah.
form of building. Yeah, yeah. What other questions have we got down here? How many houses have you managed to survey in Dunster? Because obviously that's going to make a difference to
Yeah,
your statistics, isn't it?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've got, I'm sort of aware we've got a fairly small sample there at the
Mm,
moment.
mm,
So far, we've just having a look. It's I think it's about 17 or 18 that we've looked at. We're probably, got as many as that to do again if we can get round to them.
mm.
Unfortunately, COVID came along and we were just getting up a real head of steam.
Yeah.
And COVID came along, so we've been doing very little surveying over the last couple of
Has
years, really.
made things very difficult,
Yeah,
hasn't it?
yeah,
Yeah. Oh, now look at this. We've got some response here. Of course, and I should have thought of it really. The Iron Bridge in Seven Gorge, the
yeah,
Abraham Darby one,
yeah.
that's made to look. He's obviously used timber technology
Right. Yeah,
to build the bridge, and I
yeah,
think a lot of work's had to be
yeah.
done on it
And
recently.
I guess
Yeah.
probably some of the shaping of members, because
Mm.
the inherent strength of an arch probably derives from timber and has found its way into
Yes,
steel.
yes.
Yeah.
This person has said the Iron Bridge in the Severn Gorge
Mm.
may possibly have been made of wood before casting it in wrought
Right.
iron,
Oh, right.
which is, yeah.
Mm.
Last
Mm.
time I went to see that, we did climb underneath it and
All
it was
right.
completely splitting apart. It was quite remarkable. Since
Mm.
then, I think somebody, I think probably English Heritage, have done an enormous amount of work on it
Mm.
to hold it back together. So, yes, perhaps
Mm.
it wasn't a great design. Yes, another one here. Have you been in contact with King's College about your diminishing haunch joint discovery?
Not yet. I only came across that sort of discovery a couple of weeks ago. So definitely, that's one to follow up on. And I would,
Mm.
we've got, we're very lucky on the Early Dunster Project, as we know. We've got a couple of excellent historians, and they're already on the trail of Martin Prentice. And I'm
Absolutely.
sure they'll find out something. But
Yeah. Yeah, that
it
would
just, yeah,
be good
it
to
just
link it, wouldn't
seems
it?
it just seems too big a coincidence to me that two people independently would have come up with that same joint
Mm.
within the space of 5 or 10 years, really.
How lovely to be linked to King's College. I think we can go with that.
Let's take a trip there.
Message here from the person running the Dunster Project.
Okay.
We've surveyed 28 houses so far in Dunster and probably about 20 more still to do. So that will be good. That will give you a nice database, I think.
Yeah,
when
yeah,
that's
it
done and
starts to
dusted.
get to a meaningful sample then. Yeah.
Absolutely, and that will go and join the database on the VAG.
Yeah,
site, is that right?
it's one of the things that we need to do is get the stuff we're recording into the Crux database, and that's one of the things. It's that embarrassing phrase, I was going to do it in lockdown but didn't get round to it.
I have a few of those. Yeah.
It's one of those.
But it's lovely that the Dunster Project has actually managed to link with something that's a national project as well. Good to put Dunster on the map. And it always amazes me how old some of the timber framing is in Dunster. And those buildings, I mean, I've put it down here, 1270. They must be some of the oldest buildings in the country.
Yeah. What question that sort of comes into my mind, when I'm looking at them is, was it in the mind of the carpenter when he created that building? Somebody like me would be coming along in 700 years time and recording it.
Probably not.
No, I suspect it was put it up for a purpose.
Yeah.
But they did. Some of the timbers in there are massive, huge, and they're obviously built to last.
Yes.
But I don't know if they had a perception in their mind of how long they were to last.
Perhaps that
but
was
some
just
of
how
them,
they did it.
and some of them look good for another 700 years, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, I think we're coming to the end of
Okay.
the webinar now. Tony, that was really good. This is being recorded, so we'll be being able to put it onto the SANHS website, where we have a new area on the website now at the SANHS website under webinars, and you can see all our old webinars on there, apart from the ones that are in the members area. So thank you, Tony. Thank you very much indeed. That was great. So we have some more lectures coming up, another webinar coming up quite soon on the 16th of February. Tom Maybury from Taunton Museum will be giving a lecture on the sale of Taunton Castle. And later on the 28th of April, Julian Orbach, who wrote the Somerset Pevsner, will be giving a lecture on nonconformist chapels in Somerset. So that's 2 webinars coming up. You can find out more about those on the SANHS website. Besides that, and there's a lot of events coming up soon, on the 5th of March, the Natural History Group are going to be doing a lecture in person, and that will be at the Taunton Quaker Meeting House on the 5th of March. The Local History Group, I've got a lecture in person at Castle House on the 12th of March on the Easterns. And there's the annual Archaeology Day, 26th of March, and that'll be at Wendon Village Hall. So that should be quite good. And the 23rd of April, Natural History again are going off to look at Thirlbere Wood, presumably to find some interesting plants and things. And also on the 23rd of April, Local History Group are visiting, organising a visit to Watchet Radio Museum. So there's a lot to look out for on the SANHS website there. Lots of things coming up. Keep an eye on that. And of course, if you'd like to join SANHS, again, off to the website. So that only leaves me to thank Tony. Thank you very much, Tony, for the excellent talk, and the webinar team. That's Nathanael and Harriet tonight. And thank you very much for coming along. And we hope we'll see you again very soon at another SANHS webinar. Bye and thank you.